Okay, thank you all very much for coming down to the front. We really appreciate this, as does our speaker tonight. I'm Roger Remington, and I'm the Vignelli professor. I just want to welcome you all to our November, is it November yet? No, I guess it's October Design Conversations lecture. We're very pleased this evening to have from Chicago Peter Laundy, who is arrived this afternoon. We've got a wonderful afternoon, done a podcast interview with him, and I think we're off to a good start. Looking very much forward to his presentation tonight. Just a quick word about his background. He's a graduate of Princeton University and the Yale School of Art, and he's worked extensively, including a stint with Vignelli Associates, and then also later with other firms, as well as the Doblin group in Chicago. So please join me in welcoming Peter Laundy.
Can you hear me fine now, or is...
I think the microphone might be better.
Okay, because I'll be tethered to this desk if that's the case.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so anyway, thank you, Roger, and thanks to Vignelli Center for inviting me to speak tonight, and to be back in the Vignelli community, at least to some extent here. I have been working on this talk, and I think I've come up with something that, for those of you who are interested in the history of design, there's plenty in here, and for those of you who are more interested in your futures in design and trying to figure out what they're going to be and how to do it, there's equally something in it for you. So the genesis of the talk here was that Roger wrote me and asked if I'd speak. I thought, what am I going to speak about? I don't really want to speak about my last phase, and my current phase is so new that I don't really have anything to say about it. What could be of interest? And I thought, well, you know, back when I was trying to make career decisions, and I really had very little input from anybody. It was pretty much on your own. So I suggest, and in the work I've been doing in the last 10 years or so, there were a couple of frameworks that I thought had never been used in the connection to planning your own path in design that I thought potentially could be. So I wrote Roger suggesting this. He passed it by the faculty. They thought it was a good idea, but at the same time, they were interested in learning more about my time at Massimo's, and also learning a bit more about J. Doblin, who is an important figure in the history of design. And so what I came up with is laying these couple frameworks on you all that I think might help you thinking about your own futures. And then I'm going to illustrate them, make them tangible by using them as lenses to describe Massimo's career and Jay's career and what they decided to do on their career paths. So that's what we're going to do. I'm just curious to know, in the room, to sort of know what stuff I have to cover a little more deeply or more shallowly. So how many know the name Massimo Vignelli? And how many of you that know the name know something about him and know his place in the role in the history of design? Okay, so there's plenty that don't, so that's good to know. And I imagine if that's the number, that J. Doblin is not coming to your lips three, 4 people, 5 people. Okay, so anyway, Jay and Massimo actually go back a long way. Jay hired Massimo at a seminal design firm called Unimark International that existed from 1965 to 1972 and was the first firm to really bring modern contemporary design to corporations primarily in visual identity, but also in exhibit design and product design and so forth. And I don't know if anyone has seen the film Helvetica, but there was a point in it where Michael Beirut was talking about how getting clients in was like shooting fish in a barrel, because no corporation had ever had corporate identity in this kind of way done for them before. This was the firm that was doing all those things. Ford, JCPenney, GM, Gillette, all these the things that they were doing. So they go back a long ways. And here is the one picture I have found of them together, Massimo on the left, Jay on the right. Now, I'm going to get into both of them in more detail, but one thing you should know about Jay is that he was very high in the pantheon of design thinkers. Here is an exhibit. Here is an event. He was paired within a panel with Buckminster Fuller, Marshall McLuhan, and the main psychologist that was behind the invention of Sesame Street. So he traveled in pretty rarefied circles from a design thinking perspective. So with that little bit of introduction here, I want to go into my two frameworks that I'm going to explain. The first one is a framework that a management consultant came up to describe strategy. And I think it's really important. I mean, when you think about your own personal path forward in design, it's really, strategy is what it's about. What is your strategy to make yourself happy in this thing? What is your strategy to be successful in the world? So he came up, Roger Martin came up with a very simple formulation, which is what strategy, his definition of strategy is where to play and how to win. And at the time that this was invented, corporate strategy had become very different than this. It had become sort of a annual cycle of meetings that was called strategy, but it was really a short-term planning. So there was no discussion really of where to play, and the discussion of where to win was very, very minimal. So that's its genesis. I can see where it might look to be a pretty simple and, well, of course, kind of response to this, but it was actually very useful for the firm he worked with, which was the third largest strategy consulting firm in the country. Now, the firm I worked for 19 years, leaving a couple years ago, was purchased in 2007 by that firm. And we ended up using this in the following way. We were an innovation strategy firm, and we used it to talk about what kind of portfolio of innovations a company would need to do. And the idea here is that you needed in your portfolio a lot of low risk, low reward initiatives, but you also needed transformational ones that were both high risk and high reward. So you needed a portfolio. We used the where to play, how to win framework to talk to clients about that. Just to give you a little background on this. So in terms of making this connect to what we're talking about today, I think the thought I want to leave you with is that what we're talking about is you asking yourself, where in the design do I want to play, and where do I want to, and how do I want to succeed at doing that? So the second framework was created by Charles Owen, who was a faculty member at the IIT Institute of Design, and Jay Doblin was the director of that from 1955 to 69. He hired Charles Owen, so it was on the faculty that he created that. And I'm curious, has anyone has seen this framework? The first component of it is, first of all, how do you give boundaries to some project you're doing? Because you don't have infinite resources or infinite time, yet you need to do enough to be able to come up with a valuable solution. So the first step in the design process is framing the project. And then The other steps are as follows, where you start off in the lower left-hand corner here with observation, which is very real and is focused on understanding. You move from that to try to find patterns in those observations and find meaning in the observations and take it up to a level of abstraction that turns into insight for whatever you're trying to do. Then you go from that to make the leap to a concept from the insight, and as the concept becomes clearer and clearer, more detailed, you head into execution. Now, this gives you a sense that this is a very clean, linear process, and design process is not clean and linear. You're sometimes going to find observations that make you want to change the framing. You're sometimes going to have trouble finding insights. You're going to often have to double back, but in general, this is the path that is taken in pretty much all design projects. And I use this framework for finding your path forward, because essentially, number one, I see what you are going to do. You're going to play somewhere on this if you're going to stay in design in some form. You're going to be in one of these quadrants or all of these quadrants. And even your efforts to get to a place in the design world that you'd like to be, you may need to plot some sort of strategy to get there. So this framework makes sense from that perspective. So that's why I see these two frameworks as very connected to the subject of the talk today. How we used it at Doblin was what we generally did. Our design task was to come up with new business concepts that could meet some user need that's not being met well and make money for our clients. So we would plan our projects using this framework. We would also, as we worked through a project and had major meetings with the clients and so forth, we would use it as a "you are here" kind of map as we went through the project. So taking both of these together and just summing up for a second, I think when you're thinking about the where to play half of strategy, where you're focusing is first on how you're framing the whole thing, choosing or building what professional context you want. And secondly, you're identifying where on that map you want to play and where you want others to play that you're going to depend on. So that's how where to play fits in. And how to succeed is more the tools and tactics used in the design process. So I've been working way at a high abstract level on this thing here, and I've been trying to give you some insights on it. So now I'm going to try to go back totally tangibly and say, okay, looking through this lens, how would I describe Massimo's career decisions and Jay Doblin's? Oh, I forgot one thing here. So the three applications of this process I see are, first of all, say you're out in your first job working for somebody. If you could use this to think through how it's working and how it's not working, so you can either reject it and go on to the next thing, or figure out how you can make it better. That's one way to use. That's the first way to use it. The second is, if you're trying to figure out, you really want to work at some place, or you really want to do something, but you don't have the money, or you can't get them to hire you, or whatever, you could use this as to try to find your path, design your path to getting into the context you're trying to get into. And finally, in the way I'm just about to show it to you, is you can create and design your own context and develop ways to succeed in it, which is what both Massimo and Jay did. Very different paths, but they both essentially can be described in the way I'm about to do that, to do. So Massimo, I would characterize him as a designer's designer. And I would say that if you want to identify exactly where Massimo played, I would say he played in, first of all, as he would say, from spoon to city. He wanted to design products, he wanted to design interiors, he wanted to design graphics, so he worked across some typical specialties. But that was somewhat limited because he really was interested in the stuff and the settings that accompany a cultural, well-lived life. For example, all these things are those kinds of things that he designed. And finally, he chose to have his business in New York City. That's where geographically he wanted to play, which was the center of art and center of culture pretty much globally in the time during his years. When you think about where in the design process Massimo played, what he most enjoyed and what he was most skilled at is going from insight to concept. And I'll show you some examples there. And his kind of observation was observation of what's happening in art, what's happening in design, what's happening in culture, and specifically what's the client's problem at hand. He did not at all get into doing studies to understand customers in the way that a lot of design is done. So a couple of examples I just wanted to mention in terms of this sort of insight aha to concept aha that was really, I think, one of his strengths was, for example, the aha that users desire to have different watches for different outfits. And how could there be a great solution to that? And the solution there was to come up with a single watch that you would buy that would have multiple frames around them of different colors and different materials. So it could be a purple watch one day and a silver watch the next day. Another example, during the late 1960s, he was designing promotional material for Knoll Furniture, which is a very high-end furniture company. And the basic industry standard for these kinds of brochures was very high gloss and very rich, expensive, thick paper to make them feel as high quality as possible. Massimo came in and recognizing the culture of the late 1960s surrounding him, which is things like the Whole Earth catalog and hippies and so forth. He said, no, we shouldn't be doing it this way. Let's use newsprint. Let's do it in a tabloid. And the people, his client, thought he was crazy, but they trusted enough to test it out, and it was a huge differentiator and was a really very successful example. So another insight about culture in this case, leading to a design concept. A third one that happened when I was working there was the Hauserman showroom. So the client problem was that they made walls. They made adjustable walls. And if you walked into a room that just had walls and there was nothing in the room, it's like, where is everything? The walls read as container. They don't read as object that was being sold. They also didn't have any design credibility and interest. So Massimo knew of the light artist Dan Flavin, who basically created art pieces using vertical fluorescent tubes of light that made interesting light patterns on walls, and got him to do an installation in the Hauserman showroom at the Merchandise Mart, which is the main area of furniture showrooms in the world. And that paid off for them both in terms of brand building and having done something actually interesting to the designers that came, and it also put the spotlight on the wall. So and there's this combination of going from pragmatic problem and cultural and artistic, what's happening in the world, to going to a design solution. Similarly, and many years earlier, Knoll Furniture had the opportunity to have a exhibit in the Louvre. And the key presenting problem that Massimo identified here was that the space completely dwarfed the furniture. So the concept of Haas was, on one hand, to use the huge superscale Knoll logo there, and also which also had the opportunity of making the counter in the end the entry to the whole exhibit, sort of compressing you down into a small space as you're with the large space around you, and also creating the intermediate modules of sort of 8-foot roughly or 10-foot high cubes that had a scale that was big enough for the space as an intermediate object to the objects being exhibited inside them. So anyway, all of those to me show where Massimo best played, and it was at this junction of insight to concept. So how did Massimo succeed? Well, I think one of his key things he did was he created a design language. If you saw it, it was, oh, that must have been done by the Vignelli office. And it not only was good from a business perspective of being recognizable as coming from the office, but it was also something that was very easy for people in the office to pick up. And it was also something that made concept refinement go more smoothly because you had a language to do it in that made that work better. I think the second thing that he did in terms of helping in the design process is he had a confidential design canon that he has later published and late in his career, after he had scaled back his practice, he shared with everyone. And this canon was like the principles and the deep structure of his designs that I think it was kind of the secret. Just like Coca-Cola has a secret formula, it was kind of the secret formula of Vignelli designs that made them more disciplined, forceful, and timeless than they would otherwise be, and did not really tell you why it was that way until he published the canon. Another reason Massimo succeeded is he really had an experiential perspective on stuff that you normally wouldn't even think of from an experiential way. In book design, he talked about books as cinematic entities perceived by turning pages, and one of the wonderful things about the way he would use a grid is he would say the grid is something that provides the discipline, and it's the designer the designer's role to pour energy into the book, and variety and surprise and shifts in scale and so forth to make this experiential, make it experiential. And then a very mundane item that I always found is like kind of like you wonder why it took 60 years for people to put wheels on luggage, or why it took the automobile industry I don't know how many decades to put cup holders in cars. He thought when you normally think of what to do with a shopping bag, you normally think, well, I'm going to put a picture on the big side of it. But Massimo thought of it more experientially. He thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to show something have something that's you perceive as completely blank, and when you open it up, suddenly you see the logo in what's called the gusset of the bag. And oh, by the way, that also, not only for the person opening it and suddenly having that surprise, but also when you walk down an aisle in a furniture fair, which is basically long hallways, you can see the sign on the front and the back of the bag. You would never be able to see the sign on the sides of the bag if you're walking in front toward the person or walking behind the person that's carrying the bag. So anyway, some examples of his experiential nature. Another example of how Massimo succeeded is, first of all, I told you a bit about how he used the grid, but he also used it in a way to be able to design a book in a single day, operating right at that point between insight and concept. And first of all, what he did was he worked with editors that had learned to bring all the carefully organized materials of photos and copy and everything to him, all ready to be laid out. He then took an 8.5 by 11 pad of paper that's sort of cheap paper that's a bit transparent, and he would stick a grid of the book with four spreads up usually. So you'd get 4 spreads per 8.5 by 11. And he would sketch the book out like this. And in one session, a very large book could be designed. That was basically his involvement in the entire process. And so he set up and made that process that allowed him to participate in the design process at precisely the place that he was added most value and was most interesting to him. And then let the rest of it be done by others. Another aspect of how Massimo succeeded is he designed objects with relatively simple functional requirements. He talked about Spoon to City, but he didn't design anything as complex as an airplane or an automobile or a Xerox machine or even an operating system for a computer. It was very much items that had minimal functional requirements. Also, because he was a design arbiter, and I mentioned this, I think, a bit on the diagram, he didn't need to learn about other people so much. His role was to bring his perception and his designs to the world, so he didn't really have to get into a lot of the kind of market research that other kinds of design need to get into to meet specific users' needs. And finally, he had Layla as a partner. And I mention this because it allowed him to play where he wanted to play. It allowed her she had her chunk, especially in interior design, but she also did a lot of the issues that have to be done within the whole design process and within the business process that allowed him to, and she also provided him, she could speak truth to power and be listened to in ways others couldn't. So, looking through the lens of the frameworks, that's sort of my analysis of where Massimo wanted to play and how he succeeded. Now, J. Doblin, completely different. Whereas Massimo was a designer's designer, Jay was a designer of design, and completely different way he participated in it. First of all, I thought it'd be interesting to point out that his education was in military tactical camouflage, which actually was a big deal. It was in 1942 he got this degree. I don't know if anyone has read the book about I'm trying to remember the name of it now, but about a whole division of an army that was put together by designers that was a fake division. They had like blow up rubber tanks and so forth, and the army would, remember the name? I can't quite hear.
Was it a fake city
is it?
Was it a fake city?
No, it was a fake division of an army so that the enemy would think that we were occupying and had some force someplace where we didn't at all. So anyway, that's kind of an aside to this, but I don't know why he didn't get into that. But I thought it was really interesting because one of the things that's really important to him is identifying the difference between appearance and performance. And if you think about camouflage, it's the maintaining of performance with the elimination of appearance. So that whole divide of performance and appearance that's been important to him throughout his career would come to that. Also, in that background, there's really no sort of domestic, commercial, or consumer kind of information in that at all in his training, and it basically the client would be a very large government organization. So, and he actually was much more interested in the mass market, much more interested in what was happening in big companies than Massimo was. He was a senior guy at Raymond Loewy, Lippincott Margulis, and at Unimark International, which were the big three design companies of his era, and I think the only person to have been a senior person in all three of them. In 1955 to 69, he was the director of the IIT Institute of Design, and he continued on that teaching until 1998. And he started the firm that I started working for in the mid-1990s after he'd passed away, that has gone on to be first purchased by Monitor and then that whole thing purchased by Deloitte, and is helping companies teach them how to innovate using design processes. So his real where he played was turning product and graphic design into a true profession. That was where he wanted to play, and he also wanted to do design projects that had a major impact on consumers and on companies. And I should say, there's not a lot of information about exactly what he did for these companies. I think a lot of it was fairly secret, but it was these scale of companies that he was interested in working in, which was completely different than Massimo. In terms of where he wanted to play, in knowing him later in life, he was mostly interested in going from observation to theories, and then presenting his theories, and then having others find out what concepts that could come based on the theories he had created. He did do some applied theories, and his observation was really about industry and about consumer segment behavior, which is very different than Massimo's. And also interesting in thinking of it from the perspective of the framework, this entire process was his subject matter. It wasn't, so whereas he, as a process, he focused on parts of it, the subject matter, he focused on the whole thing. So how he succeeded was doing projects for industry. I think the first thing is he always reframed client briefs. A client would come to him and say, I want X, and he would come back and say, I think if you're really trying to achieve that, then this would be a better way to go about it, and explain how he would go about it. And if they agreed with him, that would help him do another thing, which was he would always try to talk, wherever he entered a corporation interested in hiring him, he'd try to talk his way to the top of the company. And that the reframing things was a perfect way to do that, because people would either want to impress their bosses with the better idea they could bring to their bosses, or it had to be able to frame it, they would need to get approval from higher up, and that would move the whole thing up the organization. And the other way he structured projects for industry is he would create a core project that he knew would solve whatever the problem was, whatever the expectations had, but he'd also always build an exploratory project into it as well, so that connected to the theories he was developing at that time. And if that paid off, it would be a bonus, but if it fell flat on its face, the client would still have their expectations met. The other thing, how Jay succeeded, he created presentations of his theories that were quite compelling. Now, the one I'm just about to present to you is his theory of why all mass market packaging is ugly as sin. And he called it the Omni Symbolism theory. And the basic idea is that in a mass market product needs to appeal to all sorts of people and in all sorts of ways. He calls a mass market product a yes product, which means whatever you ask about it, the answer is yes. Is it small? Yes. Is it large? Yes. Is it inexpensive? Yes. Is it expensive? Yes. And so that it had to do all these different things for different people, and to symbolize all those things, you needed elements of all of them on the package, and as all those elements accrued, you got an ugly as sin package. So the crown T item is the one fake package in the middle of that he created to demonstrate the theory, and the ones around it are real ugly packaging that actually existed at the time. And the way he presented it is he just started laying one item on the other and saying, this is for this reason, and this one is for this reason, and this is for this reason, and then he gradually got up to the sort of the over-the-top version of the product, and then explained that you were getting cheap and expensive, new and old, imported and domestic, all together to get that. So that's one example of his theory work. And all three of the examples I'm going to show you here are with T as the topic. Somehow T became the one product that helped him demonstrate his theories. Now, this one has to do with a framework around appearance. I had mentioned appearance and performance were important to him. So this was what he called the discrimination matrix. And after working with lots and lots of retail companies, this was his basic segmentation of by 3 price points and by 3 levels of discrimination. And then in this presentation, he has a huge collection of teacups, and I'll just show you some of them. So this was the flash teacup in the upper left-hand corner, high price, low discrimination. This was the bad mass teacup. This was the good mass teacup. And this was the clean teacup. You may, anyone who knows the Vignelli work may recognize that mug there. So that was his thinking around appearance. And here is a class project he did, I think, for several years, but some of these photos are from 1965. Where he takes teacups from a performance perspective. And the class first identified the 8 top performance dimensions of the teacup. Then they built machines to be able to score each of these dimensions. So this is the sloshability machine that measured sloshability. This was the stability device that measured stability. And then, so he had machines the class made machines for all these, put them all through the paces. These were the end scoring of all of them against all their dimensions. This was a list of all a visual list of all the tactics used for all the various dimensions in terms of how they achieved lift or fill or whatever. And then, so I guess, and just to point out, we're all over here in observation and insight, right? This is all on the first two pieces of the design quadrant. And then the class finally, then to get to the synthesis, the concept, 1965 computer picture here where they were trying to, I think what's going on here, although I don't know for sure, is they were trying to cluster all of those various tactics to see if you used one tactic, whether you could also, in a formal way, use another tactic for a different one, to be able to see where they could find the cluster of best working tactics to be able to solve for all 8 performance dimensions. And then finally, this was the aha. This was the cup that came out. The main thing I remember about this, remembering back many years of him presenting it, was that one of the key performance dimensions was there was heat loss and heat at the beginning, because typically you pour the tea and if you drink it too early you scald yourself, and then it cools rapidly, so by the time you're 3/4 of the way through the cup it's too cold. So the specific thing they designed here was a heat sink, a big slug of metal that would, when you poured too hot tea in, it would immediately reduce its temperature, because a lot of the heat would be absorbed by the aluminum heat sink, and then that was wrapped in some insulation so that it would stay at that temperature for a very long time. Another thing I remember and how Jay succeeded, and I wish I had a diagram of this, and it happened when I was working with Vignelli. Jay brought us in on a project onto how to help Xerox, because Xerox at that point said they were no longer a copier company, but they didn't know what they were. They couldn't describe what they were, so it was our charge to try to come up with what they were. And the document company idea came out of that. But in any case, I saw Jay in action, and he was a total master at sequential diagramming, of talking to you about something, and as he was talking to you, he would have all his cluster of whiteboard markers on it, and he'd be picking the cap off of just the right color and write a little bit as he was talking, and then he would continue on telling you the story and illustrating it, and by the end of it, he had this perfectly color-coordinated whole diagram of what he had just said to you in a way that really totally had you paying attention the whole time and understanding what he was talking about. And it was something you could do in a conference room with all the lights on so people wouldn't go to sleep, that would be up close so you wouldn't be of distance. It was a much better sort of way to keep people's attention than a slide presentation like this. Perhaps the most important, I think, tactic Jay used to have impact on the world and to have his work continue was to find proteges, and to find really good proteges. And one of them he found was a guy named Pat Whitney to run the IIT Institute of Design until last year, from around 1980. One of the books that just came out about 2 or 3 years ago was 101 Design Methods. And Jay, that in a way is the culmination, I think, at least to date, of Jay's work. And if you will notice, this diagram here, this chart, this diagram is the one I've been suggesting to you for thinking about your path in design. It's the design process matrix, and it's the table of contents of this book. Those seven dots are the 7 chapters, and each chapter has several design methods in it for each of the quadrants. And the other thing, the other protege he had was a guy named Larry Keeley, who I worked with for many years at Doblin, and he carried on J. Doblin and Associates, and it's now thriving as part of a huge corporation. And one of the main frameworks they came up with that is the center of their work is the 10 types of innovation framework, which Jay had nothing to do with, but I think it would not exist in the world if it weren't for Jay's starting this ball rolling. And it's basically does a lot of, people can explain that, for example, if you just do a product innovation, it's very easy to replicate and doesn't have a lot of return on value. But if you do an innovation that does 4 or 5 of these things, it's much harder to copy. There's been they've been trying to quantify these various categories to be able to give business a better sense of what works and what doesn't. There's now an app, iPad app out to use this as part of your trying to plan innovation projects as a tool. So his work is continued, and the tactic of finding a proteges that will carry on your work for 20 or years is a very powerful tactic. So that's the end of my prepared remarks. I would like to make a couple points, though. Number one, this whole presentation is more of an homage to Jay than it is to Massimo, because it's basically an insight presentation that I hope will help you think about, that you will be able to take forward in your concept of how you design your career and what you do in design. I'd be interested in, this is my first iteration of creating this presentation. I'd be interested in getting feedback as to whether on one hand, you felt like it was being useful to you to understanding the lives of the design lives of these two designers, or whether it just kind of feels like an eggheady thing that I've laid on top of it that really wasn't helping all that much and wasn't that useful. So with that, I'll take any questions and comments. Yes. Yes.
I was just wondering, because IIT's in Chicago, Unimark was in Chicago, where was Raymond Loewy?
I don't know. I think in New York, but
What I was wondering, because when you commented on the fact that Massimo had Layla, that was actually an earlier.
that was Massimo in New York, and Vignelli Associates was in New York. Unimark, I think, was in Chicago and New York and other places.
No, I knew that, but what I meant was, yes, because Massimo left the Unimark in Chicago and opened up Unimark in New York, and then after that opened up Vignelli Associates. But so one earlier thought was that when you were talking about which part of the process was Massimo interested in, the fact that there was a Layla who was the pragmatist, and which allowed Massimo to be the dreamer, made them a wonderful partnership. But and so I'm glad you referenced that, and I'm just wondering too, in a lot of these design firms, how often is a single person handling all 4 of the parts of your grid, or do they separate that?
It raises an issue that Jay had raised and a potential point of view he had about a designer that does it all. And his point is things are getting more and more complex. That he saw Massimo's mode as a bit of a dinosaur as things get more complex, and you need to have people that are on the project that aren't even designers, so that design is becoming much more group work, multidisciplinary, than the sort of space that Massimo carved out for himself.
But the other question that I had, the reason that I was asking about where Loewy was located and then where Doblin Associates were located, because I was looking at the dates that you posted for when You know, he was at each of those different things, and what's interesting is that, you know, both with IT and the sort of the original New York and Chicago, you know, post-World War II, a lot of the artisan designers who left Europe, left the Bauhaus, there was a strong concentration in Chicago. So I'm wondering if that's what led to these really strong, innovative design firms springing up in Chicago.
Well, one thing I didn't mention, if I did, it was very briefly, that the Institute of Design was originally the new Bauhaus. And then, but the Bauhaus, the Bauhaus model, which was much more connected to art, and Jay was always much more connected to commerce and the design's power in commerce, were quite different. And when he took over, there were a lot of faculty that resigned and thought they were just getting this marketing hack and that it was completely sold out and so forth. So there was he came from completely different roots than a lot of the people you know of coming from Europe. Anyone else? Yes?
I just want to say I really appreciated personally seeing, I guess, some of the pathways to that aha moment. Because oftentimes with big designers, I know a lot about Massimo, but I don't know much about Jay, so that was also very nice. You hear about all of those kind of aha moments and things they want to just change or create or work on, but you don't see too much of that initial observation for it.
Mm-hmm.
So just the way you presented that, I thought was very eye-opening, at least for me, to see a lot of the kind of grind of moves before figuring out, like, okay, this is how I'm going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get that moment, and the concept goes.
Mm-hmm. I didn't at all go over it in the Jay's part of it, but a lot of it was so completely different at Doblin. First of all, we had, at least in the early years, we had trained anthropologists doing very well-planned protocols on generative research in the first quadrant, where they would go into people's homes and ask them questions and watch them do things and so forth, which we had none of that kind of input at Vignelli because we weren't solving that kind of problem. So like one that I thought was particularly interesting, they did a lot of work for McDonald's, and they studied people at ordering at McDonald's, and they realized that the entire model at the interface of ordering at fast food restaurants was fundamentally broken, because, as you will know, what would you like, sir? And I'm standing here behind the counter with my screen here, which you can't see, right? And then I ask you what you want. You're not going to look at me. You're going to be looking up there over my head while I'm asking you. And then, yeah, and I don't speak English very well, so you don't think, or you don't speak English. I mean, mainly, I don't speak English pretty well, and you speak English, so you're not really sure what I punched in, but you can't verify it because you can't see what I punched in. So this whole thing of looking up here, me doing it secretly involved. First, whenever you got your package, the first thing you're going to do is stand up there and take it all apart to figure out if you actually got what you ordered. So it was that kind of research that was done in the sort of the Doblin, as Doblin evolved.
I think we have to vacate the room, actually, because there's another class coming here in a few minutes, but I just want to take this opportunity to thank Peter very much for his presentation. It seems to me like he's really given us a very relevant amount of information in terms of 2 case studies and the past, the present, and the future for all of you. And I think the bottom line of it all is it reminds us that design is about thinking.
And also there's thousands of paths in design. And so there's thousands of ways to play in it.
Thank you, Peter, so much.
Perfect.